In the high, dry country of Wyoming, in the year of our Lord 1888, the world had a name for a woman like Eliza Wells. They called her Runaway. They called her Ruined. They called her a fool for leaving the protection of a husband, no matter the nature of that man's hand. The stagecoach left her in the dust of Carbon, a town that clung to a seam of coal like a burr to a blanket, and the whispers followed her before her boots had settled. She was 42 years old, with the memory of a fist blooming like a violet bruise on her cheekbone, a small carpet bag in one hand, and a silence in her heart so vast it threatened to swallow the sky. But what the whispering town of Carbon didn't know was that the silence was not emptiness. It was a fortress. What they called ruin was the raw, cleared ground on which a new life might be built. This is her story, a tale of what the world called worthless, and the quiet man who knew the worth of things others discarded. She sought work, not pity. Her posture was straight, a habit learned from a girlhood spent balancing books on her head, a life before the one that had tried to break her. She did not look at the faces of the men who appraised her on the street, nor the women who judged her from behind their curtains. She looked at the postings on the board outside the general store. Housekeeper wanted, sober habits required. Inquire S. Blackwood, Ridge Claim. The name meant nothing to her. The Ridge Claim was a half-mile walk out of town, away from the clatter and the coal dust, where the wind had its own voice. The house was not a house so much as a declaration of intent against the landscape. It was built of rough-hewn timber, solid and unadorned, with a porch that faced the endless roll of the plains. A man sat on the steps, sharpening a pickaxe head. He did not look up as she approached, the sound of metal on stone the only greeting. He was broad in the shoulder, weathered by sun and labor. His hands, resting on the axe, were maps of hard work, the knuckles scarred, the nails rimmed with the earth he fought for a living. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes were the color of a winter sky, clear and startlingly direct. They took in her worn dress, the fading bruise, the determined set of her jaw. He did not flinch, nor did he leer. He simply waited. "I've come about the housekeeper position," she said. Her voice was steady, though it had not been used for much more than prayer in weeks. He nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "You have experience?" "I can cook, clean, mend, and manage a larder. I can read and write, and cipher accounts." The list was a shield. It was the sum of her utility. "The last one couldn't handle the children," he said, his voice a low rumble, like rocks settling deep underground. "They're wild." "Children are children," Eliza replied, a statement of fact that asked for no argument. He considered her for a long moment. The world saw a woman past her prime, marked by some private violence. Silas Blackwood saw the straightness of her spine. He saw the unashamed way she met his gaze. He saw the competence in her plain, honest words. "The pay is $4 a week, plus room and board. You'll have the small room off the kitchen. Work is sun-up to sundown. Sunday is your own." He laid out the terms like stones in a foundation, solid and without ornament. "My name is Silas. The children are Martha and Caleb. I am Eliza." She did not offer the name Wells. It belonged to the man she had left behind, a name that felt like a brand. Here, she would be only herself. "Start now," he said, and turned back to his pickaxe. The transaction was complete. It was meant to be temporary. A port in a storm. A place to earn enough to move on, further west, to a place where no one knew her name or her history. That was the plan. But the high plains of Wyoming had plans of their own. The house inside was clean, but stark. It was a place of function, not comfort. The air smelled of wood smoke, old coffee, and a lingering loneliness. The children were as he had described them. Martha, at 10, had her father's watchful eyes and a distrust so profound it was a physical presence. She stood in the doorway of the main room, arms crossed, a silent, miniature judge. Caleb, 2 years younger, was a whirlwind of untamed energy, his face smudged with dirt, his knees torn out of his trousers. He stared at Eliza with open curiosity, a wild thing trying to decide if she was predator or prey. They did not speak to her. They watched. Eliza did not try to win them. She did not offer smiles or sweets. She offered instead the quiet rhythm of competence. She unpacked her few belongings in the small cold room off the kitchen. There was a narrow cot, a single window looking out onto the endless sage, and a nail on the wall for her dress. She placed her only book, a worn copy of Jane Eyre, on the windowsill. Then she tied on an apron and went to work. She started with the kitchen. She scrubbed the cast-iron stove until it shone a dull, respectable black. She organized the tins of flour and sugar, the sacks of beans and potatoes. She found a patch of wild mint growing near the well and crushed a few leaves in a cup of hot water, the clean, sharp scent cutting through the stale air. She moved through the house not with haste, but with a deliberate, steady grace. Her hands, which had been taught to play the pianoforte and embroider delicate flowers, now commanded soap and water, needle and thread, fire and flour. There was a solace in the work. It was honest. It yielded immediate, tangible results. Dust vanished. Order emerged. That evening, she made a simple stew of beef and potatoes and biscuits that rose light and golden from the oven's heat. The smell filled the small house, a scent of warmth and care it had not known in years. When Silas came in from his work, he stopped just inside the door, his head tilted slightly, as if listening to a long-forgotten song. The children ate without a word, their eyes on their plates. But Caleb, who usually bolted his food, ate slowly. And Martha, who watched Eliza's every move, took a second biscuit. It was a victory so small as to be invisible, but to Eliza, it felt like the turning of the earth. Weeks passed. The bruise on her cheek faded from violet to a sickly yellow, then vanished into the pale landscape of her skin. The rhythm of the house became her own. She rose before the sun, her first task to light the stove, the flare of the match a small defiance against the dark. She cooked and cleaned and mended. She learned the sounds of the house, the groan of the floorboards under Silas's weight, the whisper of the wind through the eaves, the frantic scratching of a mouse behind the wall. She did not speak of her past. Silas did not ask. Their conversations were brief, functional exchanges about the necessities of life. We need more flour. The pump handle is loose. A storm is coming from the west. Yet, in the spaces between the words, something else was being built. He would leave a pail of fresh water for her on the porch each morning, saving her the first trip to the well. She would leave a hot plate of food covered for him on the stove, no matter how late he returned from the claim. They were small, unspoken kindnesses, a language of action, not words. The children remained her greatest challenge. They were sharp-edged and wary, their grief for their mother a wall around their hearts. Eliza understood walls. She did not try to breach theirs. She simply existed, a constant, steady presence. She patched Caleb's trousers with neat, almost invisible stitches. She braided Martha's tangled hair one morning, her fingers gentle and sure. The girl flinched at first, then stood impossibly still, her whole body rigid with a mixture of fear and a desperate, unvoiced longing. When Eliza was done, she didn't say thank you. But the next morning, she stood by the stove with the hairbrush in her hand, waiting. The turning point came not with a word, but with a book. One evening, a storm blew in, the wind howling a mournful song around the corners of the house. The children were restless, their energy trapped indoors. Caleb was fidgeting, knocking things over. Martha was staring into the fire, her expression closed and sullen. The air was thick with unspoken tensions. Without a thought, Eliza retrieved her copy of Jane Eyre from her room. She sat in the worn armchair by the fire, the only comfortable piece of furniture in the house, and opened it to the first page. There was no possibility of taking a walk that day, she read, her voice quiet but clear, carrying over the sound of the wind. The children froze. They turned to look at her. Reading aloud was a luxury, an intimacy they had not known. She did not look up. She kept her eyes on the page, letting the story unfold. She read of the orphaned Jane, of her loneliness, her quiet defiance. She read until her throat was dry. The fire had burned down to embers, and she realized the room had fallen completely silent. Caleb had curled up on the rug at her feet, his head resting on his arms, his eyes wide and fixed on her face. Martha sat on her stool, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her guarded expression softened by the flickering firelight. Even Silas, who had been cleaning a piece of equipment at the table, had stopped his work, his large calloused hands still. She closed the book. The silence that followed was different from the one that had lived in the house before. It was a shared silence, filled with the ghost of a story. "Read more tomorrow?" Caleb asked, his voice small and sleepy. It was the first direct question he had ever asked her. "Yes," Eliza said softly. "Tomorrow." From that day on, the ice began to break. The house on the ridge claim started to feel less like a shelter and more like a home. The children began to talk to her, first in trickles, then in torrents. Caleb would bring her treasures from his wanderings: a raven's feather, a smooth grey stone, a desiccated grasshopper. Martha would stand beside her as she baked, asking quiet questions about measures and methods, her initial suspicions slowly giving way to a grudging respect, then a fragile, tentative affection. Eliza, in turn, began to unfurl. The tightness in her chest, a knot of fear she had carried for years, began to loosen. She found herself humming as she worked. She planted a small kitchen garden in the hard-packed earth behind the house, coaxing lettuce and radishes from the unforgiving soil. The small green shoots felt like a miracle. They were proof that life could take root even in the harshest of places. Silas watched it all. He was a man accustomed to observing things closely. The subtle shift in the color of rock that might signal a vein of silver, the changing patterns of the clouds that foretold the weather. He observed Eliza with the same quiet intensity. He saw the way her hands, once soft, were becoming capable and strong. He saw the way the children orbited her, drawn to her steady warmth. He saw the life she was breathing into the empty spaces of his home, of his family. He had hired a housekeeper. He had not expected a miracle. One afternoon, Eliza took the wagon into Carbon for supplies. It was a task she had come to dread. The town was a constant reminder of the world's judgment. The women still whispered behind their hands. The men still looked at her with a mixture of pity and contempt. She had learned to erect a wall of polite indifference, to move through the streets with her eyes fixed on her destination, her face a neutral mask. On this day, Mrs. Gable, the storekeeper's wife and the town's most venomous gossip, was holding court by the flour barrels. She saw Eliza enter, and her voice rose, sharp and carrying. "Some women have no shame," she declared to her audience of 2 other women, "leaving a good husband to fend for himself. And for what? To take up with a dirt scratcher and his motherless brats. It's unnatural." The words struck Eliza like stones. The air in the store grew thick and still. She felt the familiar hot flush of shame creep up her neck. Her hands, gripping her shopping list, began to tremble. She wanted to turn and flee, to run back to the safety of the ridge. But then a shadow fell across the doorway. Silas stood there. He must have followed her into town for some reason of his own. He took in the scene in an instant. Eliza, pale and frozen. Mrs. Gable, her face flushed with malicious triumph. The other women, watching with avid curiosity. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a scene. He simply walked into the store and stood beside Eliza. He put his large, solid presence between her and the gossiping women. He did not look at them. He looked at Eliza. "Did you get the salt?" he asked, his voice calm and even. The question was so ordinary, so mundane, it shattered the dramatic tension in the room. Eliza, startled, looked up at him. She could only shake her head. "I'll get it," he said. He moved to the shelf, his back to the women, a silent, immovable dismissal. He picked up a bag of salt and brought it to the counter, along with a tin of coffee and a small bag of peppermint candies he knew Caleb liked. He paid the storekeeper, his movements unhurried. The silence in the store was now an awkward one. Mrs. Gable and her friends, their moment spoiled, muttered their excuses and scurried out. Silas picked up the heaviest of the sacks. "Let's go home," he said. They walked to the wagon without speaking. Eliza's mind was a turmoil of shame and a strange, burgeoning gratitude. He had not defended her. He had not fought her battle. He had simply stood with her. He had made her battle his own. The ride back to the ridge claim was quiet. The only sound the creak of the wagon wheels and the sigh of the wind. When they arrived, he helped her unload the supplies. As she turned to go into the house, he put a hand gently on her arm, stopping her. He looked down at her, his face serious in the fading light. He saw the tremor that still lingered in her hands. He saw the shadow of the old fear in her eyes, the fear of a world that judged and condemned. "Nobody hurts you again, Eliza," he said. His voice was low and rough, but the words were as solid as the mountains on the horizon. "Not here." It was not a question. It was not a romantic declaration. It was a promise, a foundation stone laid for a future neither of them had dared to imagine. And for Eliza, who had spent a lifetime being told she was worthless, who had been hurt for saying no, for wanting to be more than property, those words were the most beautiful she had ever heard. They were the sound of a key turning in a lock she had forgotten she carried. The sound of a door opening, not onto a temporary shelter, but onto a place she might, finally, call home. The promise settled into the house and changed its very atmosphere. The line between employer and housekeeper, between stranger and family, blurred and then dissolved completely. The arrangement was no longer temporary. It was life. Eliza's small garden expanded. She planted beans that climbed tenacious strings and squash whose broad leaves shaded the dry earth. She bartered some of her bread in town for 2 chickens, and their cheerful clucking became a new part of the homestead's music. Silas, for his part, began to build. He added a lean-to the side of the house for storing wood, his hammer blows a steady, rhythmic counterpoint to the day. He fixed the porch step that had been loose since his wife's passing, and one Saturday, he began constructing a small set of shelves on the wall next to the fireplace. He did not say who they were for. He simply measured and sawed and hammered, his movements precise and economical. When he was finished, he sanded the rough pine boards until they were smooth to the touch. He stepped back and looked at Eliza. "For your books," he said. She had only the one, but the gesture was an acknowledgement of a part of her that had nothing to do with cooking or cleaning. It was for the Eliza who read stories by firelight, the Eliza who had a mind beyond the scope of her duties. She ran her hand over the smooth wood, her throat tight with an emotion she could not name. Later that week, when the circuit preacher came through town with a box of donated books, she traded a jar of her preserved peaches for a slim volume of poetry and a tattered Shakespeare. She placed all 3 on the new shelves. They looked small and lonely, but they were a start. The shelves were a promise of more. The seasons turned. Summer's fierce heat gave way to the sharp, clean air of autumn. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. The work of preparing for winter settled over them, chopping wood, canning the last of the garden's bounty, reinforcing the chicken coop against the coming snows. They worked together, a silent, efficient team. He would split the logs, and she and the children would stack them. She would prepare the vegetables, and he would mend the seals on the canning jars. In these shared tasks, a new intimacy grew. It was an intimacy born of labor, of mutual reliance and respect. He learned the particular way she sighed when she was tired. She learned to read the set of his shoulders to know if the day's work in the mine had been fruitful or frustrating. They rarely touched, but they were in constant orbit of one another, their lives weaving together in 100 small, daily acts. One evening, as a cold wind rattled the windows, he came in from the dark, his face grim. He held out his hand. In his palm lay a tarnished silver locket, shaped like a heart. "Found this," Clearing out the old trunk, he said, his voice rough. It was Mary's, my wife's. Eliza looked at the object, then at his face. His eyes were full of a deep, abiding sadness. He was not just giving her a piece of jewelry, he was sharing the shape of his loss. She was a good woman, he said quietly. She was not made for this country. It was too hard on her. Eliza took the locket from his palm. Her fingers brushed his, and a jolt, warm and startling, passed between them. She did not say, "I'm sorry." The words were too small for the weight of his grief. Instead, she said, "Tell me about her." And so he did. He spoke of a girl from Ohio who loved to sing, who planted roses that never bloomed in the harsh Wyoming soil, who gave him 2 beautiful children before a fever took her one cruel winter. As he spoke, Eliza polished the locket with the hem of her apron, rubbing away the years of tarnish until the silver gleamed softly in the lamplight. She handed it to Martha, who was listening from the corner, her face solemn. "It was your mother's," Eliza said gently. "You should have it." Martha took the locket, her small fingers closing around it. She looked from the locket to Eliza, and in her eyes was a dawning understanding. This woman was not trying to replace her mother. She was helping them remember her. The last brick in the girl's wall of resentment crumbled into dust. Winter arrived, blanketing the world in a pristine, silent white. The family drew inward, their lives contained within the 4 walls of the small house. The world outside ceased to exist. Their home became a fortress of warmth and light against the cold. The evenings were filled with the scent of baking bread, the sound of Eliza's voice reading aloud, the quiet scratch of Caleb's knife as he whittled a piece of wood, and the steady presence of Silas, mending a harness or simply watching the flames in the stove. It was in the heart of that winter that Eliza realized she was happy. The emotion was so foreign, so unexpected, it startled her. It was not a giddy, breathless happiness, but something quieter, deeper. It was the peace of a ship that has found a safe harbor after a long and violent storm. She was needed. She was respected. She was safe. She had begun to believe that this was all she could ever ask for. She had not dared to hope for more. The thaw came in late March, with a warm wind that smelled of damp earth and renewed life. And with the thaw, a letter arrived. The postmaster from Carbon rode out to the claim himself, a rare occurrence that signaled a matter of importance. The envelope was of fine, heavy paper, the address written in an elegant masculine hand. It was addressed to Mrs. Eliza Davies. The name was a ghost from another life. Seeing it felt like a physical blow. Her blood ran cold. Silas took the letter from the postmaster and handed it to her without a word, his eyes searching her face. She took it with a trembling hand. She did not need to open it to know who it was from. It was from him, from the husband she had fled, Mr. Davies. She read it standing by the kitchen window, the paper shaking so badly the words blurred. He had found her. After nearly a year, he had tracked her down. He wrote of his forgiveness, of his desire for her to return to her rightful place by his side. He wrote of his duty, of her vows before God. But beneath the veneer of civility, the words were cold and hard. They were not an invitation. They were a summons. They were a reminder that in the eyes of the law and of the world, she was his property. He would be arriving in Carbon within the fortnight to collect her. The fortress she had built around her heart was breached. The old fear, the familiar shame, came rushing back in, a toxic flood. She dropped the letter, as if it had burned her. Silas picked it up. He read it in a single, sweeping glance. His face, already weathered and creased, seemed to turn to granite. He looked at Eliza, at her white face and terrified eyes. He saw the woman who had arrived in his yard a year ago, bruised and silent. He saw how far she had come, the life she had painstakingly built from the ashes of her old one. He crumpled the letter in his fist. "No," he said. The word was a piece of the mountain itself, unmovable. "He has the law on his side, Silas," she whispered, her voice ragged. I am his wife. You are here, he replied, as if that simple fact negated all other claims. This is your home. These are your children. He did not say my children. He said your children. The distinction was everything. 2 weeks later, a hired carriage, gleaming and out of place, rolled into Carbon. Mr. Alastair Davies stepped out. He was a man of medium height, dressed in a fine wool suit that defied the dust of the town. He was handsome in a severe, pinched way, his mouth set in a permanent line of disapproval. He carried a silver-headed cane and an air of absolute authority. He expected to find a fallen, destitute woman whom he could easily cow into submission. He expected to be met with deference by the rough inhabitants of a backwoods town. He did not expect Silas Blackwood. Davies made his way to the ridge claim, his polished shoes acquiring a fine layer of Wyoming dust. He found Silas waiting on the porch, not with a weapon, but with his arms crossed over his chest, his feet planted wide. He looked as if he had grown directly from the earth. I am Alastair Davies, the man announced, his voice clipped and superior. I have come for my wife. She is not here, Silas said, his voice flat. Eliza and the children were inside, the door shut, but he knew they were listening. Davies's eyes narrowed. Do not play games with me, you simple miner. She is my legal spouse. I have come to take her home. Her home is here, Silas stated. A flicker of rage crossed Davies's face. He was a man accustomed to being obeyed. She is my property. The law supports my claim. If you interfere, I will have the marshal arrest you for harboring a runaway. Then you'd best go get him, Silas said, not moving a muscle. The confrontation moved to the town. Davies, incensed, went straight to the marshal, a weary man named Cobb who preferred a quiet life. Davies presented his marriage certificate and a letter from his lawyer, laying out his legal rights in no uncertain terms. Marshal Cobb knew the law was on Davies's side. He also knew Silas Blackwood. He knew him as a man who paid his debts, kept his word, and had single-handedly raised 2 children after his wife died. He had also seen, over the past year, the change in the Blackwood family. He had seen the woman they called the housekeeper. He'd seen her in the store, her back straight, her dignity intact. He'd seen the way the children, once wild, now stayed close to her side. He had seen the way Silas Blackwood looked at her. The town, which had once judged Eliza so harshly, was now a silent jury. They had witnessed the same transformation. They had tasted her bread, traded for her eggs. They had seen her quiet strength. Mrs. Gable, who had once been so cruel, now found herself strangely reluctant to take Mr. Davies's side. The man was too smooth, too sure of himself. He didn't fit. Eliza, with her quiet competence and her sad eyes, did. Marshal Cobb, Davies, and a small crowd of onlookers made their way back to the ridge claim. This time, when Davies called for his wife, Eliza came to the door. She stood just behind Silas, the children flanking her, their small hands clutching her skirt. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. She looked at the man who had been her husband, the man who had hurt her, and she felt not just fear, but a cold, clear anger. Eliza, this foolishness has gone on long enough, Davies said, trying to regain control. Come with me now. She lifted her chin. No. It was the word that had earned her beatings, the word that had been the start of her ruin and her salvation. This time, she said it not in a locked room in the dark, but in the bright, clear light of a Wyoming afternoon, with her family at her back. Davies's face contorted with fury. You will do as you are told. Marshal, arrest this man. She is coming with me. Marshal Cobb shifted his weight, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. He looked at Davies, then at the family standing united on the porch. He looked at the faces of the townspeople gathered behind him, their expressions unreadable, but not hostile. He had a choice to make. He could uphold the letter of the law, or he could uphold a different, unwritten law of decency and community. Mr. Davies, the marshal said, his voice slow and deliberate. This is a small town. We tend to our own. The lady has said no. It seems to me the matter is settled. I'd advise you to be on your way. Before you wear out your welcome." Davies stood, utterly defeated, not by force, but by the quiet, unyielding wall of a community that had chosen one of its own. His legal authority meant nothing here. His power was an illusion. He gave Eliza one last look of pure hatred, then turned on his heel and stalked back to his carriage, a man of importance rendered irrelevant by the simple, powerful fact of belonging. The dust from his carriage settled. The onlookers dispersed, there murmuring a quiet tide of approval. On the porch, the four of them remained. The temporary had become permanent. The shelter had become a fortress. The housekeeper had become a mother. The silence that fell was deep and profound. Eliza looked at Silas, her heart so full it felt it might break. He had not needed to fight. He had only needed to stand. His presence had been her shield. That evening, after the children were asleep, they sat on the porch as the last light bled from the sky. The world was quiet, peaceful. The great trial was over. Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple ring of braided silver. It was not new or fine. It was worn smooth with age. "It was my grandmother's," he said, his voice quiet in the twilight. "She was a strong woman, like you." He held it out to her. It was not a proposal that asked for vows or legal documents. It was an offering, a symbol of what they had already become. He was not asking her to be his wife in the eyes of the world that had just been vanquished. He was asking her to be his family in the world they had built together, right here on this ridge. Eliza looked from the ring to his face, his kind, steady eyes. She thought of the woman who had arrived a year ago, broken and ashamed. She thought of the journey from surviving to living, from being needed to being chosen. She held out her left hand, the hand that had been bruised and empty, the hand that had learned to knead dough and tend a garden and stitch a wound and hold a child's hand. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. 10 years later, the house on the ridge claim had grown. A new room had been added on the east side, its window perfectly placed to catch the morning sun. The porch was wider, with 2 sturdy rocking chairs that Silas had built. The garden was a sprawling, thriving testament to a decade of care, and the chicken coop now housed a noisy, bustling flock. The bookshelf inside held not 3 books, but 30, their spines a colourful patchwork against the pine. The world outside had changed. The town of Carbon had boomed and then begun to fade as the coal seam thinned. But on the ridge, life had only deepened, its roots growing stronger with each passing season. Eliza, now 52, sat in one of the rocking chairs, a mending basket in her lap. The grey in her hair shone like silver in the afternoon light. Her face was lined, not with fear, but with the fine etchings of laughter and sun and time. Her hands were never still, but they moved with a peaceful, practiced rhythm. She was no longer a runaway, a ruin. She was the matriarch of this small, solid kingdom. She was Eliza Blackwood. A young woman of 20 sat on the porch steps, reading aloud from a book. It was Martha, her face a lovely blend of her father's strength and her mother's remembered softness. Her voice was clear and confident as she read, a gift Eliza had given her that no one could ever take away. Near the newly fenced pasture, a young man of 18 worked alongside his father, repairing a stretch of wire. Caleb was as tall as Silas now, his shoulders broad, his hands as capable as the man who had taught him everything he knew. Silas finished his work and walked toward the house. He moved a little slower now, a slight limp, the only price the mine had ever extracted from him. He saw Eliza watching him, and a slow smile spread across his face. It was a sight that never failed to make her heart feel full. He sat in the chair beside her, reaching out to take her hand. His was still rough and calloused, hers softer but just as strong. Their fingers intertwined, a familiar, comfortable weight. The ring he had given her was worn to a soft gleam. They didn't need to speak. They sat in the comfortable silence they had built together over years of shared sunrises and sunsets, of hardships faced and joys quietly celebrated. They watched their children, living proof of the life they had forged. The world had once defined Eliza by what she had lost, by the man she had fled. But here, on this ridge, she had been defined by what she had built, by the family that had chosen her, by the man who had seen her worth when she could not see it herself. He had promised that nobody would hurt her again. And he had kept that promise, but he had given her so much more than safety. He had given her a place to belong. He had given her back her name and her heart. Martha finished a chapter and closed the book, a contented sigh escaping her lips. Caleb and Silas finished their work and headed for the well to wash up for supper. The smell of roasting chicken drifted from the kitchen window. It was just another ordinary day, a jewel in a long string of ordinary beautiful days. What the world called worthless, love had proven to be a treasure beyond any vein of silver. A life, like the hard Wyoming soil, had been cultivated with patience and care, and it had brought forth an astonishing, improbable, and deeply precious harvest.